Welcome, Andrew. Good to see you.
Alexandra, yeah, thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
And you can just call me Alex. Totally fine. It
Awesome.
doesn't take so much airspace.
I'll do
So,
that.
yeah, please share with listeners something about who you are and the work that you do.
Yeah, I'm the CEO and founder of a company called Curious Lion, and we help primarily sales teams, but I would say companies and any team inside company create cultures of continuous learning. And it's been 5-6 years of running that business. I have a background in adult education. I spent 12 years working at KPMG, where I did this for that entire time. And so it was interesting to see it inside a corporate environment. And yeah, for the last 5 or 6 years, we've been trying to undo everything that I learned at KPMG, try and innovate with the clients that we work with.
So a couple of questions there. Obviously, you've used the word curious, and curious is in your company title. Why Curious Lion?
So the other thing you may have picked up, as I know you have as well, clearly, is an accent. So your listeners may pick that up. I'm originally from South Africa, where I grew up, and I've been in the States for about 12 years now. But it's been a real cool process to bring that South African side into the naming of the business. And yeah, so the lion is a tip to Africa. It's a tip to, I'm also a Leo by birth. And so I've always had an affinity for lions. And so it was remembering back 5-6 years ago, and I just basically put those two words together, and I was like, that's a cool name for a company.
That's a cool name. I like that infusion of your background into where you are now. The other thing I wanted to ask was, you talked about working in adult education in KPMG. Can you just talk a little bit about that? Because I think, listeners of Right Medicine probably have a different experience of adult learning and adult education in the healthcare workplace. Can you just talk a little bit about how that looks in a corporate setting?
Yeah. So we were responsible for training a multinational population of audit professionals, right? So it's accountant by background. I think this is where it's similar to folks who are working in medicine. I know continuing education is a big part of what you do. And so there's a third party in all this. There's a licensing board that sort of has to certify the quality of the education to award the credits. And so we were dealing with the exact same thing. Those were professional education credits for qualified accountants, which I am. And yeah, so that was a similarity of it. The other characteristics of that environment, it's a multinational professional services firm. So it's very, time is money, literally, right? So people are very busy putting out a lot of different fires, and you're competing against that. It was difficult, to be honest. I'm like reflecting on it now. I haven't really thought about it that much for a long time, but it's really tough because you've got this really busy professional, and then you've got these, I'll be honest, draconian laws and regulations that you have to follow from these professional bodies. And so you end up having to create education, which absolutely doesn't educate anybody. It's to check the box exercise. And I spent my 12 years of my life doing that. And it's a little frustrating. We got to do a lot of other training as well, which was really transformational and taking people from apprentice to professional. And that was really cool. And that was very peer-to-peer based and that kind of stuff. But the continuing education piece, of which the accountants have to do 40 hours a week. I don't know what it is for people in your audience, but it was brutal. It's that whole system is broken in my mind.
I think that your description of checking the box is something that certainly a lot of learners in the continuing medical education space will recognize. And the flip side of that is that the education providers are always trying to find creative and innovative and accessible ways to make sure that education is not simply about box checking and is really focused on learning and behavior change. So we'll get to that in just a minute. 2 more questions and the kind of curious theme. One is, I listened to your podcast, Learning Culture. And at the beginning of your podcast, you have a voiceover of an English speaking gentleman. Is it John Reith or is it someone else? I keep meaning to research. Who is this person?
I know the answer. My team has that answer already. I wish you'd asked me before. I would have had it for you.
I know.
I'll put it. I'll get it. I'll get it to you, and you can put it in the show notes. But yeah, I definitely know who it is. I can't think of it now.
No, it's really interesting. And then the final thing here: you were in KPMG for 12 years. That culture became challenging. Why?
Yeah, is those ongoing demands of having to create 40 hours of something to satisfy the licensing board. It resulted in this very kind of top-down broadcast. Like, you're just teaching what you're doing is what we were doing was broadcasting people things that they should know, trying to stuff it into their heads, literally, and then checking that they remembered those things. That's what we're doing. And that is not learning. Like, there is no way you tell me that you can tell whether that person can actually do something different now because of what you just did or forced them to do. And yeah, so it's basically that. And it's funny, when I started Curious Lion, I went straight back into that routine of creating that top-down stuff. And my initial idea was like, oh, we'll just do better content. We'll use high production video, and we'll really think about that learning journey and all of that. But my whole view on that has really evolved. That's just one tiny part of a much bigger puzzle.
So that problem of retention, recall, it's not enough. So let's talk about learning culture and how you define that, because that seems to be the container for what you're doing now in your work.
Yeah, so learning culture to me is a set of norms that a group of people follow for how to learn on their own and together, right? And so it's a systems-wide view. It's an ecosystem. It's a set of behaviors, of conditions that allow learning to happen. And it's a very Peter Senge and all those great writers in his sort of lineage talk about learning organization, right? And that this idea of this like almost organism, you could say learning organism, which all of us are, right? Actually, if you think about it, but thinking of that at the company level. So what does a learning organization look like? This autonomous learning system of people learning and sharing and collaborating that's going to create knowledge, and more than just knowledge, it's going to create people that can do things far greater than the sum of its parts.
And so how do you, first of all, I think that description of learning culture is something that people working in healthcare would recognize. Certainly there's been a move over the last few years to think about health systems as learning systems. And there's I think some of that work comes from the Institute of Healthcare Improvement, but I'll double check and make sure to put a link in the show notes. But that idea that the workplace organization is itself a learning culture, but what are the building blocks of a learning culture?
Yeah. A shared vision is probably first and foremost, right? Having a North Star of what are we working towards here? What do we want to see? What is our impact going to be in the world? So that's got to be in place. And the shared part is key. It's not a vision that's top down and created by a marketing team, right? It's a truly, Peter Senge talks about shared vision being the sum of personal visions of everyone in the company, right? So that's really what we're talking about here. And there's a whole process to allow that to emerge. Then there's the sort of the team learning aspect of it, which is peer-to-peer, collaborative, social. There's content plays a part, but people consume content very differently these days, and you've got to give options, and you've got to really be concise. There's a whole lot we can talk about there. There's also the personal elements. Peter Senge talks about personal mastery, and it's just this idea of the individual accountability for learning. So how, as someone in this team or in this ecosystem, what is my view on learning? Do I see, for example, failure as a good thing? Do I see it as a learning opportunity? Do I take accountability for things that happen to me, or do I blame other people all the time? Little things like that. So just that personal approach to learning, and learning how to learn fits under that as well, which I think is a really vastly under-trained or under-focused area for people. Like just learning how to learn and learning how you learn, especially, so key to teach people. And then I think Yeah, I think that might be it. Maybe systems thinking as well is worth a separate call out there to really look at how this all fits in together and how the system, the feedback that's created within the system, the interplay between things. If you move something here, what impact does it have elsewhere? Like, I think that's also an important piece of it as well.
So systems thinking, learning about learning, shared vision, content, 4 things that we can dig into just a little bit there. Can we start with that shared vision piece? How do you, when you're working with an organization, and actually maybe you should say a little bit more about how you work with organizations to create a learning culture in the first place?
Yeah, happy to. So first and foremost, a conversation has to happen around what are we trying to achieve here in terms of actual business metrics? Do we want to reduce expenses? Do we want to grow revenue? Do we want to, it gets a lot, that's very high level, but it gets much more granular. We especially be focusing on a specific team, sales team, right? So then it's metrics around that. So what are we looking to actually impact here? Then we want to identify a role or a group of people, usually so that we call that a team. We want to identify a team. So it's your sales team or your this team, that team. And we want to show how that team and the people within it can impact those business metrics through a list of actions. So what are the desired actions? You can think of behaviors, mindsets, anything like that we want to see happen that we believe together with the business executive sponsor will impact those metrics. And so that's the strategy part of sort of setting that all out and saying, okay, so these are the activities and actions that you want to see. All right, so now how are we going to create the behavior change for that to happen? So the next step is to build out what does an ideal version of this archetype, this person look like. So we typically do a kind of a radial chart around skills, competencies, etc. that the client, and this is where the shared vision part comes in, right? So it's co-created, and it eventually creates this visual picture of what good fully looks like. And then we can go and talk to each individual, or actually not talk to them, but just survey them so they can self-assess where they are on this new spectrum, right? And then they get these slightly different shapes, right, within that radial thing. And so now they have a blueprint of where they are, and they also obviously see where they could be. And so then we design all the different learning journeys that can improve all the different arcs of that radar, of that sunburst. And so now you've got all of these kind of mapped out. This can be done one by one, and you take people through. Obviously, it takes a long time to have all of the pathways there, but that's eventually the end goal. And then you've got people then can decide, all right, I need to improve on this axis. And so I'm gonna take that learning journey. So that's the micro behavior. We also look at a macro perspective as well through all of this. So what are the conditions for learning? And we have a scorecard that we use. It measures 40 things, and we were able to perform a diagnostic with the company to essentially measure their health of their learning culture across these 40 aspects. That gives us a really good picture of where to focus to start to improve, right? So now we've got interventions at the macro level. I'll give you an example of one of those, just so you know. So we prioritize internal talent promotions, right? Like that's one key thing. It's been shown that if you do that, is going to help increase your learning culture, right? We have clear decision-making paths for people, or decision-making factors, so no one becomes a roadblock. There's no roadblocks created within a company, right? So that's another thing. So people can go and actually do things to learn, right? So we got 40 of those. And so we're measuring that, and we're helping the client then figure out, okay, here's where to improve. And we've got remedial actions there. And now we've got those learning paths that we talked about, and we run programs. And so the key thing there in the rollouts and deployment is to really make a big impact up front. Motivation plays a huge part of this. I'm a huge believer in the self-determination theory. And we use that a lot in our work, and making sure we check the boxes on the competence, relatedness, and authority, and making sure all of those conditions are in place. So we get that motivation. The program itself needs to really get people to quick wins early, and that's so key as well. We can talk about what those programs look like as well if you want. And then once that's working and it's going, people are not going to see massive behavior change in 30 days, right? But if we can get that initial quick wins, we start to get buy-in for the right people, and we can start to scale this. And so it's always typically starts with a pilot, and that pilot we try and do 100-day pilots, and then that eventually starts to prove out the worth of something. Now we can start to add maybe new groups within that. We can add new programs. And so it builds. Yeah. And then eventually our goal with our clients is that we build something that they own and can run. It should somewhat run by itself actually at some point, but without us, right? So that's the end goal.
But it takes time to get there. And it sounds as though you're spending a lot of energy and investment on building internal motivation. I think and we can come back to that, I think one of the challenges in continuing medical education and continuing education in healthcare is that so much of the motivation is external. It's a requirement.
Yeah. Exactly.
In order to maintain your license, you've got to get so many CE credits a year, so many CME credits, and so on. I'm curious about the self-assessment. It sounds very familiar. Is it My Snapshot?
No, but I know Charlotte Crowther very well. Yeah, it's similar. It's the exact same concept. It's getting people to self-assess themselves on that scale. Yeah.
But it's really interesting how you, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, My Snapshot?
Oh, I'm actually working with Charlotte myself at the moment because I'm building out a curriculum for medical writers who want to specialize in CME content. Yeah, I'm working with Charlotte. And I like the way you talk about aligning the micro and the macro. And and what you said there does take us to content. I know you said a few minutes ago that we're all consuming content in different ways now. What kind of content and in what type of formats and delivery modalities do you find you are creating to support a learning journey?
Yeah. The short answer is all of them.
Right.
The longer answer is, so I think people, especially millennials, which make up over almost 90% of the workforce now, and this will change obviously in very soon, but the content consumption is a skill and a curse, right? And so everyone, I think, in that cohort most people are really good at going on the internet, quickly finding something, right? We also, unfortunately, so that's the pull aspect of it. We also have the push aspect. So we got different social media apps, etc., YouTube, whatever, there's a fire hose of information, right? So finding things is not the problem. We could talk about vetting that it's a credible source. I think that's a very important, learning how to do that, how to assess a source and stuff is also useful. But then there's the curse side of it, obviously, that there's too much. How do you know? It's related to the credibility, the source question, right? Because it's how do I know which one to trust here? And I just need to pick one, that kind of thing. So long way to answer your question. What we try to do here is we play the role. And actually recently I heard a company and talk about how they leave it up to the learner to find it because of the things we just talked about. Learners are so good and comfortable with going on YouTube, Googling, whatever. But I think that's a cop-out. I don't believe in that. What we do is curate content, and then we provide, and we'll curate and prioritize, right? So there is, obviously, we all know, a never-ending black hole on whatever topic you want to learn about. What we'll do is try find the 1 to 2 of the best pieces of content out there. It could be a podcast, it could be an article, it could be a book, it could be TED Talk, whatever it is, so videos. Curate that content. We also create, and I think our creation focuses on summary, on context, on analysis, right? Those kind of things. So that's watch this thing and focus on this, or think about that, or whatever. So it's that kind of thing. And so the service we provide is curating, then helping with that summary, assessment, etc. And then we also provide a long list of other stuff. And so you always we're not trying to say this is the only thing you should look at or read or watch or whatever on this topic. Here's also a recommended, and then if you have time, go on the rabbit hole. That's what our team does. We're all 100% curious. So that's how we think about it. It's not about, don't get fancy. I'm really not a big believer in buying a lot of off-the-shelf content. I think that's, again, unless the person who's created it is a very credible source that also has the ability to teach. And I don't know if you, Alex, have found that skill set in many people, but it's not, in my case, often in the same person, right? Where they're an expert in their domain and they're a gifted teacher. That's a very rare combo. And yeah, that's how I look to find content.
Yeah, no, I think you're on point there. It's part of the model in a lot of continuing medical education is that there will be multiple people involved in developing content, from writers to strategists to instructional designers, perhaps to graphic designers, maybe. But there will be a subject matter expert who is usually a clinician, and they will provide the expertise to guide the shape and the direction of the content. And faculty will, depending on the format, they will be involved in that teaching component. And that's where challenges can really start to emerge, because beyond doubt they are the subject matter experts, but to your point, often they're not in that gifted teacher category.
One thing I'd add to that, it's a great point, I totally agree with you, is it needs to be it needs to be entertaining as well, right? You have to engage people, and I use that word entertaining deliberately, because it's a lot of people misinterpret that, and they're like, oh, it must be funny, or it must be it needs to entertain people as much as it educates people, because if you're not getting both of those things right, you're just not getting attention, and attention's the currency. That's what we want.
Yeah. And so in that vein, a couple of questions about how you're developing the content. Are you working with instructional designers? Are you working with, who's doing the curation?
Yeah, so we have a team of learning architects, and that's their sole job, is to do research, to design, to write. I am cultivating a highly creative team to be able to do that. Their job needs to be very creative. The research part, we have some people who are better at that than others, but I very much foresee the research part being able to is going to get easier and easier with technology like AI and stuff coming out. To me, the creative part, and especially the ability to write creatively, but also think creatively, etc., is the key thing here. And so that is the team I'm building and what we are equipped to do.
I love that term, learning architect. And when I think about thinking creatively in terms of that curation aspect, one of the skills there is connection, being able to connect the different layers of ideas and also have some sense of their source material. I think one of the things that we find, particularly in millennial created content, is that there's a lot of wheel reinvention, because people don't necessarily seem to have that depth skill where they're able to see that this idea is actually millennials old. It's a deeply philosophical point, but they're not able to necessarily see the source of the idea. I'm conscious of our time. You've been talking about workplace learning cultures, the marriage of macro and micro. What are some of the things that you see as being really important in developing lifelong, agile, reflective learners? Because the reflective learner is definitely something that has a lot of currency in the CME/CE world. And I think you hinted at that when you were talking about that self-determination theory and that self-assessment process. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, reflection is a huge part of this. I'll throw coaching out as well, because I think that's a very big part of this as well. And I don't know if that applies to the world that you're in, but talk about reflection first. I have this idea of a circle of learning, and the circle is at its smallest when the learner is just consuming information. All right. Once they start to do something with that, the circle gets a little bit bigger. So now they're consuming and doing something. Once they start to reflect on what they do, and then go, oh, this is what I can do better next time. And really in that Anders Ericsson deliberate practice approach, it's getting bigger. So now they're consuming, doing, and reflecting. Then at sharing to it, it gets bigger. So now I'm talking to someone else, I'm getting feedback on it. I'm now having to explain my thoughts, and I realize I don't actually know it as well as I did, et cetera, et cetera. And so now that circle's getting a lot bigger. That's where, so first of all, most people stop at just consuming, right? Some people do. The sharing part is where if I can get 80% of a company up to that stage, brilliant, right? There's one more step that makes the circle the biggest, and that is teaching. So if we can start to get people to then go in, and my biggest thing is you don't have to be the world's leading expert, or you in your company, the number one expert on that thing to be able to teach it, because it is valuable for you to teach what you've just learned, because you know exactly where everyone else is coming from. You are that point of not knowing it was just a few days or weeks ago for you. So really encouraging that and getting people to share and teach what they're learning is it's an incredible thing once you see it start to work in a company.
So consuming, doing, reflecting,
sharing,
teaching, five circles I love that. Obviously in medicine, there's the see one, do one, teach one model, which has been discredited over the years. A lot of people get very sniffy about that's not really how we learn anymore. But I don't actually think that's the case, precisely because of that teaching component. If you really want to learn something deeply, you got to teach it to somebody else. Yeah, and 100%. I think that's what you're reflecting.
Richard Feynman would agree with us. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Now you're writing a book. Is that correct? Are you writing a book at the moment?
I am actually. Yeah, right. I am. Yeah.
So what's the book going to focus on?
Yeah. So the macro kind of perspective we talked about earlier. So I think a name I'm playing with now is total enablement. Now the enablement part originates from an audience that we work with, sales teams. They have a function it originated in B2B SaaS companies, software as a service companies, and it's sales enablement, right? And I think it's just a brilliant term to describe what we're trying to do. We're trying to enable people to reach their full potential, or enable people to do something differently. And then in the service of selling more, whatever it is for that company, of course. But I love the idea of enablements. I think it's a great term. And that particular function it's very young and has gone through a bit of an identity crisis recently because of layoffs and all that in the tech industry. Yeah. And so I think there's an opportunity I saw an opportunity towards the end of last year to try and take a stab at describing what it is we're trying to do. And I'm calling it total enablement, to really get that holistic, integrated perspective on it. What I'd like to do in the book, and by the way, anybody listening, this is anything I basically write now on LinkedIn or that goes up on my blog is probably going to end up in them. So you can follow along as I go, because I'm discovering this as I go along. I don't know the answer right now. Otherwise, I probably would have written the book. But that's the goal, is to write about total enablement and make it a practical guide for anybody who wants to enable a team of learning to take place, a team of people to learn autonomously in that sort of learning organization aspect.
And that's one of the things that's really shifted in the CME CE world, is that there is an increasing focus, or there has been an increasing focus on team-based education over the last few years. And there's now a whole kind of joint accreditation process around accrediting programs that are specifically for teams by teams. So I'll make sure to, at this point, have your contact information, your LinkedIn profile in the show notes, so that people can reach out to talk to you about that. Any final thoughts before we wrap up here?
It would be more a question. What would you say is the biggest concern or challenge or question that people in your audience have?
I think it's around behavior change. How to use education and adult learning in a way that really fosters meaningful behavior change that will translate into healthcare improvement. That's the that's the thread of connection and direction, is how to use these checkbox forms of bites of education to really foster significant change in what people are doing, how they're doing it, and the impact that makes on healthcare quality.
Well, so I've got I think a good closing thoughts on that, because I look at behavior change as identity change. So I think to be able to get someone to change their behavior, they've got to want to do it. And a few conditions have to be met. They have to first, number one, have an idea, a clear picture of their current reality. Now, there's a lot of things holding people back from that current reality, from seeing that current reality. And a lot of those things are internal, right? They're living in doubt. They're living in limiting beliefs. They're living in whatever it is that is stopping them from seeing and accepting current reality as it is, and not getting down about it, but just accepting it, right, as it is. Then there must be some dissatisfaction with that current reality. Right. Then there must be some vision of what success or what a better future could look like. And then there must be a clear pathway to show that it's possible to go from current reality to future state, or at least an idea of what the next step should be.
Yes.
And I think if you get those things right, then that's all you can do, really, because then it's over to the learner, right? They need to decide. If they go through that process and go, yeah, I actually do want to have that better life, or that better car, or that better body, or that better job, or whatever, then they can go on that path of development. And it's self-determined, right?
Self-determination, that is the core of this conversation. Curious Lion, Andrew Barry, thank you so much for sharing your insights with listeners of Right Medicine.
Thank you so much for having me, Alex.